Hey guys, today I am coming to you from Monticello, which was the home of Thomas Jefferson. And that is because we are starting the period four review, which begins with the beginning of his presidency. This is going to be part one of the period four review. I'll post part two a little bit later. Period four in the complete version goes from 1800, which is the election of Thomas Jefferson in the Revolution of 1800, when power peacefully changes hands between the Federalist John Adams to the Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson, and shows that our democracy works. And goes all the way to 1848, which is the end of the Mexican-American War, as we are kind of achieving our manifest destiny and transitioning into all of the problems and conflicts that will come about as we're trying to work our way through becoming a larger nation. So this period for part one review is going to start with 1800, and we're going to go through the era of good feelings and the market revolution. And then part two will pick up with kind of the bad parts of the mid 1800s that were kind of being swept under the rug during the era of good feelings. We'll go through the Jackson presidency and all the way until the end of the Mexican-American War. So to get started with period four, part one, we start in 1800 with the election of Thomas Jefferson, and there are two main things that I want to mention about his presidency in this video. There are, of course, a million things that we could talk about with Thomas Jefferson because he was a huge, key figure in our history since even before the start of the official United States. But for the sake of this video, I'll focus on two things. And one of those is, of course, the Louisiana Purchase. You guys might remember that the Louisiana Purchase was pretty beneficial to the United States. We got all of this land, which doubled the size of the United States, for a steal. Okay, it was a lot of money back then, but even then, it was not nearly what it could have been. So it was a very good deal. It's quite a bargain. And Thomas Jefferson purchases this territory, and that kind of helps to gain momentum for our manifest destiny and our expansion, which of course manifest destiny has its own problems, but we're going to view it as a positive right now. We expand our country, we gain additional resources, and this helps to strengthen the U.S. and to rid ourselves of some additional European influences that we had been dealing with since we had become independent. So in a lot of ways, this was a positive for the United States. However, Thomas Jefferson really doubted this decision and perhaps regretted it because it did go against all of the beliefs that he had set forth as a Democratic Republican with their strict interpretation of the Constitution. There were no guidelines for a president purchasing territory. And of course, he found a loophole here, interpreted that Constitution loosely, kind of stretched his powers in order to do so, which went against everything he had been talking about for forever. The second thing that I want to mention with Thomas Jefferson is the Embargo Act of 1807. As you guys know, we continued to have a lot of trouble at sea with the British and the French. They were having their own problems over in Europe, and we kind of got trapped in this, messy business between them. And Thomas Jefferson had spent a lot of time cutting down on the size and the power of the government, as a Democratic Republican would. He had cut to the Navy, he had cut, funding, and so he needed to find a way to try to deal with all this trouble we were having at sea. And so the idea was to create an embargo, or a law that stops trade, that would hurt British and French businesses so that maybe they would figure out that they need to be nicer to us. Um, didn't work the way that Jefferson wanted it to. It actually backfired. And instead of hurting the British and French businesses, it really hurt American merchants more than anything else. Which leads us to this cartoon that I'm going to show you guys. Some of you have seen this and discussed this with me before, but I want to make sure that you all get a chance to see it. So this is the famous cartoon that I'm talking about. And if you look at it, you see here a British ship. You see this guy who's trying to carry this barrel of something out to the ship, and he's being bitten by this turtle. And if you look at what he's saying here, it seems really odd. Oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. What the heck is an oh, grab me? So one thing that you can learn about political cartoons is if you see something like that that seems a little weird, there's a good chance that the artist is trying to tell you something, and maybe you should, put on your thinking cap and try to figure out what's going on there. So here, the oh, grab me, if you look at it backwards, it spells embargo. So he's saying, oh, this cursed embargo, which of course is what is stopping him from being able to trade with Britain. So therefore, in this cartoon, that is portrayed by this turtle. So this cartoon is just telling us or showing us the pain and burden that is affecting American merchants because of the embargo. So that obviously was not a super popular move by Thomas Jefferson. It didn't work the way that he wanted to. It comes at the end of his presidency, and causes his domestic policy to not be super popular at the time. Another thing that Thomas Jefferson has to kind of struggle with throughout his presidency is his relationship with the Supreme Court. This time period for the Supreme Court is called the Marshall Court, for the Justice John Marshall, who was a very, very outspoken Federalist, which definitely put him at odds with Democratic Republican President Thomas Jefferson. So throughout Jefferson's presidency and beyond, the Supreme Court under the Marshall Court is consistently passing through these new, precedents and things that give more power to the federal government. And there's a whole bunch of cases we could talk about. If you look back in your notebooks, you'll find a foldable that has, I think, about 8 of them. But for the sake of this video, I'll just mention one, which is, of course, the ever famous Marbury versus Madison. And hopefully it sticks in your mind that Marbury versus Madison established the precedent of judicial review, which gives the Supreme Court the power to determine whether or not legislation is constitutional. And so that is obviously additional power for the Supreme Court, aka the federal government, which is a definite Federalist move. And that is something that Thomas Jefferson battled with throughout his presidency, because that went against what he had hoped for as a Democratic Republican. So again, if you are maybe a little bit confused about what those court cases were, look back at your notebook and you'll find more examples. We're going to move on to our next president and the next big event in our country. The next president was James Madison, and the biggest thing that we focus on for his presidency is the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is not super significant as far as winners and losers and territory that's lost or gained. It really doesn't change a whole lot in the United States, except for our mindset, our attitude. And that change in our mindset and attitude is going to have a huge effect on our country for a couple of decades to come. So the War of 1812 is a result of a couple of different things that had been building up for a while. When we talked about it in class, I gave you the acronym of FBI, like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, W. So I know that that isn't necessarily reminiscent of anything else, but that's just how I remember it. Maybe it's helpful to you too. So the F stands for freedom of the seas. We were having all these constant troubles with the French and the British at sea, things like the Embargo Act, which were restricting merchants, and things like impressments, which is the I part of FBIW. And this was kind of breeding hostility towards the British and resentment within the United States. And of course, we didn't need much of a reason to be resentful towards the British after the American Revolution. The B stands for British aid to Native Americans. As you know, the colonists and then the citizens of the United States, the Americans, were kind of constantly fighting against the Native Americans. As we continued to encroach upon their land and upon their culture, they were fighting back. Around this point in time, there was a Native American leader named Tecumseh who was leading a confederation of Native Americans to fight back against American encroachment. And as the Americans were fighting them, we found that the British had allied with them and were providing with them with support and with weapons. And so that gave us another reason to be ticked at the British. Impressments, the I part of FBIW, was what was happening when the British would seize American ships, and they would sometimes take sailors and impress them back into the British Navy. Some of those sailors were already British. We weren't far from being British ourselves, all of us. So, not necessarily like they were taking captive a bunch of Americans, but they were taking hostages nonetheless from these ships. And lastly, we have the war hawks, the W part of FBIW. These were people who, senators, representatives, etc., mostly Democratic Republicans, who were really advocating for us to go to war. They thought that it would be beneficial to us, it would solve a lot of problems that we had, and we would come out as a stronger nation. So those are all the things coming together that lead us into war. I'm not going to focus a lot on the battles and things of the war. It does get pretty crazy when the United States decides to invade Canada, which was British owned, and then the British retaliate by burning down the White House and burning large parts of Washington, D.C. But those specific battles are not super important, except for the last one, which was the Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans actually takes place after the war was officially over. The treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Ghent, had already been written and signed and was on its way back to us, but we didn't know because, hey, no communication, no quick communication, at least. So as we're waiting for this treaty to arrive, this battle takes place, and the leader at that battle for the United States is going to be Andrew Jackson, who at this point in time is obviously not president yet, but he is making a name for himself in this battle. And the battle is really neither here nor there when it comes to victory, but the United States viewed it as a victory for us. And then after the battle happens, here comes the treaty. So it seems like because of that battle, we had won the war. So even though not a lot really changed, there wasn't a lot, gained or lost during the war, we see this as a big victory for ourselves. We've kicked the British twice. We're the victors. And we have this growing sense of pride, this nationalism in the United States because of that. So we're officially independent. That has been reaffirmed. We've put down some of the Native American rebellion. We've rid ourselves of more and more foreign influence, and we're really ready to devote attention to growing ourselves as a nation. And this is really when we start to see the development of some of those other AP themes, like the growth of our, national culture and things like that. So, this time period of kind of nation building and the growth of culture is going to be called the era of good feelings. And you will see some of this pride displayed in some of the art and literature of the time. Um, we call this the golden age of American literature, and we see lots of writing about the proud lifestyles and the righteous lifestyles of people in the United States and the bravery and courage of people who were fighting the Native Americans on the frontier and taming this wild land to establish a new nation. We talked about the Hudson River School, who were these artists who painted the beautiful landscapes of the United States to show, how much of a treasure we were and how proud we were to be here. But beyond those cultural changes, we also have some political and economic changes that demonstrate the changing times within the United States. Politically, this is a time of peace and an era of good feelings because we really only have one political party. The Federalists had kind of embarrassed themselves during the War of 1812. Federalists had always tended to be more loyal to the British, more supportive of a relationship between us and the British, mostly for economic interests. So during the War of 1812, a group of them get together at something called the Hartford Convention, and they, come out and say that we should not be fighting against the British and the war should stop. And so as we're victorious in this war, people see them as kind of, anti-American and kind of wussies. And so they lose a lot of respect and a lot of their, reputation during the War of 1812. So going into the era of good feelings, the Democratic Republicans are really running the show. And the president at the time is going to be James Monroe, and he's going to benefit from this era of good feelings and peace in politics. One of the things that he's known for is his Monroe Doctrine, which was basically that statement that, European monarchs should stay away from the Western Hemisphere. This is kind of our zone, and we want them away from here. So this kind of asserts this idea of American power that we may or may not have been able to actually support had we had to. But we are setting ourselves up as the main force in the Western Hemisphere. On the economic side of things, we see a plan presented by our old friend Henry Clay, 5-time candidate for president, never elected, but he sure did a heck of a lot of work in the United States. And one of the things that he presents is an economic plan that's centered on something he called the American system. And basically, his idea was that we needed to get our economy growing. We need to boost our industry. We needed to create a national market. And a lot of that was going to come about by improving the infrastructure of the United States. So we needed new technology, we needed new transportation, and of course, all of that needed money. And so he promotes a protective tariff to be used to fund all of these internal improvements, as he called them, and also a national bank to help manage all of those things. You guys know that tariffs and the national bank had caused controversy for the longest at this point, and typically that would be something that Federalists and Democratic Republicans would argue over. Typically, it was something that the Democratic Republicans would oppose. So it's kind of wild that this is coming about during a time when the Democratic Republicans are in charge. But because it's the era of good feelings and people are putting the country and what we need above their own personal interests, we see some dedication to improving the country, whatever it takes. So we're going to really work toward that, and we are going to see some of these improvements that Henry Clay asked for. And all of those things are going to result in what we know as the market revolution. So you guys might remember that when we talked about the market revolution, we did the Shark Tank activity in class where you guys all advertised some new invention, some new technology, some new transportation. And all of those things were really the foundation of the market revolution. What we mean when we talk about the market revolution is this big change that we saw in the economy of the United States and really around the world. As the United States, we start to shift towards industry, especially in the North. We see factories developing, new labor systems developing, and just kind of a new way of doing things. This also leads to what we call a national market, where each region of our country, the North, the South, the West, they're all going to be united together in a national market. For example, up in the North, they have factories, they have textile mills that are producing fabric. What might that fabric be made from? Cotton. Where might that cotton come from? The South. So those two are becoming to be more and more interconnected. As people are developing out west, they need manufactured goods to make that happen. And that brings them into this interconnected US market as well. So instead of having local and regional markets as we had before, we now have a national market. And all of that is made possible by new inventions, things like the cotton gin. Obviously, the cotton gin had a huge negative impact as well, which was the rapid increase of slave labor and new territory that was going to be devoted to slave labor. But inventions like that and other, industrial machinery are going to kick our industrial production into high gear. We also have changes in transportation, the railroad, the steam engine, which will be used in things like steamboats, the development of not only the railroads, but also canals that those steamboats can travel on. All of those things are going to make transportation much quicker and easier, which helps to promote that connected United States. We no longer have to be just kind of separate regions that are loosely connected. We have a connected culture, we have a connected government, we have a connected economy. So all of those things also help to contribute to this era of good feelings. Now, I've told you before that the era of good feelings was not perfect. There are a lot of bad things going on at this time too that we were kind of sweeping under the rug and just putting a Band-Aid on, hoping that it would go away. So that's where I'll start the period for part 2 review, and that'll be posted in just a little bit after this one. I hope to see you guys soon. Stay well and keep checking Canvas. Bye.